Hello comrades, it's TheFinnishBolshevik. This time we'll be continuing the series on Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder. We'll be discussing Chapter 7, Should we participate in bourgeois parliaments? At this point I should also say something about how communists want to use elections, because Lenin doesn't actually go into that in this chapter. He only explains why boycotting elections is something that you should only do in exceptional circumstances, and that in most cases it would be advisable to participate in elections. I've spoken about these things in previous episodes, but I'll just quickly recap here. Communists consider that capitalist elections are basically a sham. All the parties that are most likely to win are the ones that are all funded by the capitalist class. They are all capitalist parties. They all serve the same interest, the same capitalist interest. That's why it really doesn't matter if the Democrats win or the Republicans win, or in Finland if the coalition party wins or the center party wins or the nationalists or the social democrats, because they all serve the capitalist class. Capitalism will not be overthrown regardless of which one of those parties wins. They have certain differences, of course, but they are all capitalist parties. Of course, the working class and the Communist Party can achieve electoral success. That has happened sometimes in history. Even though capitalist elections are very unfair, all the odds are against the workers and in favor of the capitalist parties. But it is still possible for the communists to win in bourgeois elections sometimes. And it is possible for communists to get into the parliament and be able to implement new laws and to make changes to state policy. But that is not the primary reason why communists want to participate in parliamentary elections. Communists want to participate because the communists need to be where the masses are. Since the masses are interested in elections, the communists also need to go there. The communists use election campaigns, election debates as platforms to talk about communism and spread the ideology of Marxism. It's really about that. It's about spreading the message and not about actually winning the elections. When communists participate in capitalist elections, they actually should always explain why the elections themselves are unfair and kind of pointless. So they should use bourgeois parliamentary elections against bourgeois parliamentarism. Now, let's assume that the communists actually got a sizable amount of people into the parliament and that they were able to change certain laws. Karl Marx famously said that the proletariat cannot simply take over the bourgeois state machine, but they have to smash it and create a new proletarian state machine. So even if the communists were to get into the parliament, and even if they were to get a majority in parliament, they would still have to smash the bourgeois state machine, so they would have to dissolve the bourgeois parliament and replace it with some kind of proletarian institution. And that is, in fact, what happened. For example, in all the Eastern European people's democracies where the communists actually did win parliamentary elections, they replaced the bourgeois parliaments with the proletarian representative institutions. Obviously, in Soviet Russia, they also did that. They carried out a revolution and eventually dissolved the Constituent Assembly, which was then replaced by a proletarian representative institution known as the Congress of Soviets. So basically, the so-called left communists, they stated that communists should never participate in any kind of parliament, never participate in any kinds of parliamentary elections or anything like that, and Lenin is arguing against them. So this is what Lenin writes, quote, "Should we participate in bourgeois parliaments? It is with the utmost contempt and the utmost levity that the German so-called left communists reply to this question in the negative. Their arguments, in the passage quoted above, we read," and then Lenin quotes from a pamphlet by the left communists, which says, "All reversion to parliamentary forms of struggle, which have become historically and politically obsolete, must be emphatically rejected." So then Lenin comments on this. He says, "This is said with ridiculous pretentiousness and is patently wrong. So-called reversion to parliamentarism, forsooth. Perhaps there is already a Soviet Republic in Germany. It does not look like it. How then can one speak of a reversion? Is this not an empty phrase? Parliamentarism has become quote-unquote historically obsolete. That is true in the propaganda sense. However, everybody knows that this is still a far cry from overcoming it in practice. capitalism could have been declared, and with full justice, to be historically obsolete many decades ago, but that does not at all remove the need for a very long and very persistent struggle on the basis of capitalism." Unquote. This is one of the main points that will be reiterated in the course of this chapter. So the left communists are saying that parliamentary struggle is some kind of form of struggle that has become obsolete, that it's become outdated, and that nowadays we have better forms of struggle, while Lenin makes the point that, yes, bourgeois parliaments, in a sense, are historically obsolete because capitalism itself is historically obsolete. Like, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. Capitalism is now an outdated system that needs to be replaced by socialism. We have all the prerequisites to build socialism. Humanity is ready for a proletarian revolution and for socialism. So yes, in that sense, bourgeois parliamentarism is historically outmoded, just as capitalism is, but that's not the same thing as overcoming those things in actual real-life practice. You can say that parliamentarism is outdated, and you can say capitalism is outdated, but you still need to overthrow capitalism. Lenin continues, quote, "Contrary to the opinion of such outstanding political leaders as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the German so-called lefts, as we know, considered parliamentarism politically obsolete even in January 1919. We know that the so-called lefts were mistaken. This fact alone utterly destroys at a single stroke the proposition that parliamentarism is quote-unquote politically obsolete. It is for the so-called lefts to prove why their error, indisputable at that time, is no longer an error. They do not, and cannot, produce even a shred of proof. A political party's attitude towards its own mistakes is one of the most important and surest ways of judging how earnest the party is and how it fulfills in practice its obligations towards its class and the working people. Frankly acknowledging a mistake, ascertaining the reasons for it, analyzing the conditions that have led up to it, and thrashing out the means of its rectification, that is the hallmark of a serious party. That is how it should perform its duties, and how it should educate and train its class, and then the masses. By failing to fulfill this duty, and give the utmost attention and consideration to the study of their patent error, the so-called lefts in Germany and in Holland have proved that they are not a party of a class, but a circle, not a party of the masses, but a group of intellectualists, and of a few workers who ape the worst features of intellectualism." Unquote. This obviously is a very important point, and it's a pretty famous quote. A communist party always needs to evaluate their practical policies and the results of those policies, their line and the results of that line. They need to evaluate, okay, this is what we've done, these are the results we've gotten. Has our line been successful? Has our line and policy been correct? And obviously evaluating those things is not easy, but it still must be done. And Lenin concludes here that the German and Dutch left communists, they have not actually evaluated the real facts and the real political conditions. They have not actually evaluated if, based on real life conditions, their policy actually is correct and successful. It's more like they have a certain principle, they have a certain ideological prejudice, they want to boycott the parliament, so then they just do that, and they stick to that regardless of any real-life conditions, regardless of what the results are. They're not interested in reality, they just want to hold on to their ideological position. What's that famous quote? Is it a Hegel quote or a Fichte quote? I forget, where he says that I have a theory, and if reality doesn't match my theory, then so much the worse for reality. But anyway, let's keep going. Lenin says, quote, "In the same pamphlet of the Frankfurt group of so-called lefts, which we have already cited in detail, we read, the millions of workers who still follow the policy of the Catholic Center Party are counter-revolutionary. The rural proletarians provide the legions of counter-revolutionary troops." Unquote. And then Lenin comments on this left communist pamphlet, and he says, quote, "How can one say that parliamentarism is politically obsolete when millions and legions of proletarians are not only still in favor of parliamentarism in general, but are downright quote-unquote counter-revolutionary. It is obvious that parliamentarism in Germany is not yet politically obsolete, unquote. So if millions of workers, proletarians, who are supposed to be the target audience and the popular base of the Communist Party, and who are supposed to be the revolutionary class, the class which actually is going to lead and carry out the revolution, if those people, millions of them, still support parliamentarism and still engage in parliamentarism, then that proves that parliamentarism is not politically obsolete. It's still very relevant to the lives of proletarians. It's still very relevant to the political activity of the proletariat. We can say that it would be better if the proletariat didn't want to engage in parliamentarism and instead they engaged in something else, but that's just our hope. That's what we would like to be the case, but that's not actually what is the case. The reality of the situation is that the proletariat has not moved beyond parliamentarism. They still vote in elections. That's still one of the main ways that they participate in politics. And that's one of the main ways that they understand politics. It's not like elections are just some small thing that barely anybody cares about. Lenin continues, quote, "It is obvious that the so-called lefts in Germany have mistaken their desire, their politico-ideological attitude, for objective reality. That is a most dangerous mistake for revolutionaries to make. Parliamentarism is of course politically obsolete to the communists in Germany, but, and that is the whole point, we must not regard what is obsolete to us as something obsolete to the class, to the masses. Here again we find that the so-called lefts do not know how to reason, do not know how to act as the party of a class, as the party of the masses. You must not sink to the level of the masses, to the level of the backward straight off the class. That is incontestable. You must tell them the bitter truth. You are in duty bound to call their bourgeois democratic and parliamentary prejudices what they are, prejudices. But at the same time, you must soberly follow the actual state of the class consciousness and preparedness of the entire class, not only of its communist vanguard, and of all the working people, not only of their advanced elements." Unquote. And this is super important. In so many instances, this is the crux of the matter. Because so many parties and so many people, they make mistakes when it comes to this in either of those directions. Either they lower themselves to the level of the backward straight off the masses, where they pander to the more backward elements, where if the masses are religious, or if the masses are racist, or if the masses are generally ignorant of this or that, then some communists want to pander to that and lower themselves to the same level because they don't want to alienate the masses by challenging them in any way. But then at that point, you're not leading, you're not actually doing anything productive, you're just lagging behind what the masses themselves are already doing spontaneously. So you're not actually providing any kind of useful leadership. When in reality, what the Communist Party needs to do is they need to improve and elevate and increase the level of class consciousness of the masses and to help organize the masses. However, and this is the second mistake that often happens, and this is what left communists do, even though the communist vanguard needs to increase and elevate and improve the level of class consciousness of the masses, and even though they shouldn't pander to the backward elements among the masses, the communists still can't go too far ahead of the masses. The communists need to meet the masses where they are. They need to meet them at a point where the masses can actually understand them. Then Lenin continues, he says, quote, "The so-called left communists have a great deal to say in praise of us Bolsheviks. One sometimes feels like telling them to praise us less and try to get a better knowledge of the Bolsheviks' tactics. We took part in the elections to the Constituent Assembly, the Russian bourgeois parliament, in September to November 1917. Were our tactics correct or not? If not, then they should be clearly stated and proved. Did we, the Russian Bolsheviks, not have more right than any Western communists to consider that parliamentarism was politically obsolete in Russia? Of course we did, for the point is how far the masses of the working people are prepared, ideologically, politically, and practically to accept the Soviet system and to dissolve the bourgeois democratic parliament or allow it to be dissolved. It is an absolutely incontestable and fully established historical fact that in September to November 1917, the urban working class and the soldiers and peasants of Russia were, because of a number of special conditions, exceptionally well prepared to accept the Soviet system and to disband the most democratic of bourgeois parliaments. Nevertheless, the Bolsheviks did not boycott the Constituent Assembly, but took part in the elections both before and after the proletariat conquered political power. That these elections yielded exceedingly valuable and to the proletariat highly useful political results has, I make bold to hope, been proved by me. The conclusion which follows from this is absolutely incontrovertible. It has been proved that, far from causing harm to the revolutionary proletariat, participation in a bourgeois democratic parliament, even a few weeks before the victory of a Soviet republic, and even after such a victory, actually helps that proletariat to prove to the backward masses why such parliaments deserve to be done away with. It facilitates their successful dissolution and helps to make bourgeois parliamentarism politically obsolete." Unquote. So first he makes the point that the left communists praise the Bolsheviks and they praise the Soviets, and they also claim that boycotting the parliament is always correct, even though the Bolsheviks, in fact, participated in the parliament. So that's an inconsistency. And then Lenin says, if it was actually wrong to participate in the parliament, then the left communists should prove that with some kind of real historical experience, but they don't do that because they're not actually very interested in real historical experience or real-world practice. And then he makes a very interesting point. He says that because of the revolutionary situation in Russia at the time, they actually had a much better argument to say that the parliament has become obsolete, because the masses actually were in the middle of a revolution. They were participating in mass protests, mass strikes, and eventually an armed revolution. So they actually were participating in all these forms of class struggle which were more revolutionary than parliamentary struggle, while in Western countries that wasn't the case. And this is actually a very interesting argument because oftentimes people and organizations have claimed that, okay, well, since now the masses have awakened to some kind of revolutionary action, therefore the time for parliaments is over. And that kind of makes sense. And later in this chapter, Lenin talks about a situation where that actually was true. But that's not always true. Because here he says that even though they were in the middle of carrying out a revolution, it still didn't do any harm to them that they had guys in the parliament. In fact, it was useful for them. Why is that? Well, because even though a revolution happened, a lot of the masses still thought that the parliament was good and that the parliament was important. Of course, there's reasons for that, such as, well, there was the February Revolution, which overthrew the monarchy. The people were saying that they need to have a democratic republic, and of course a democratic republic would be ruled through a parliament. Then the provisional government said that they would organize a parliament, but they were kind of stalling and delaying. And then the people were saying, like, no, come on, you need to organize the Constituent Assembly, organize the parliament. We need to have elections. We want to have elections. And people had put a lot of hope in the parliament. They thought that, like, it would be some great thing that they would get. So the Bolsheviks, they knew that the people had faith in the parliament, so they wanted to be involved in it. And then they could show people that actually the Constituent Assembly was a sham, which eventually the masses realized. And then a couple years later, when the Mensheviks and the bourgeois liberals talked about, oh yeah, we need to bring the Constituent Assembly back, the workers just mocked them. But that wasn't the case yet in 1917. So you could argue that, yeah, the parliament clearly became obsolete because they eventually dissolved it. But before the dissolution happened, it wasn't so obsolete. And then Lenin even says that for dissolving the parliament, it was actually useful to have guys inside the parliament to facilitate its dissolution. Let's move on. So Lenin says, quote, "Now let us examine the so-called Dutchleft arguments in favor of non-participation in parliaments. The following is the text of thesis number 4, the most important of the above-mentioned Dutch theses, which says, When the capitalist system of production has broken down and society is in a state of revolution, parliamentary action gradually loses importance as compared with the action of the masses themselves. When, in these conditions, Parliament becomes the center and organ of the counter-revolution, whilst on the other hand the laboring class builds up the instruments of its power in the Soviets, it may even prove necessary to abstain from all and any participation in parliamentary action." Unquote. So that's what the left communists said. And Lenin replies to that. He says, "The first sentence is obviously wrong, since action by the masses, a big strike for instance, is more important than parliamentary activity at all times, and not only during a revolution or in a revolutionary situation." This obviously untenable and historically and politically incorrect argument merely shows very clearly that the authors completely ignore both the general European experience and the Russian experience of the importance of combining legal and illegal struggle. Unquote. So first of all, it's pretty interesting that the left communists in this instance, they look at this very mechanically, where they think that only when there is a revolutionary situation, only then actions of the masses themselves become more important than parliamentary actions, when Lenin says that action by the masses is always much more important than the parliament. And then he says that the left communists don't understand the importance of combining legal and illegal struggle, and it's perhaps not entirely clear what he means by that, but I think what he's trying to get at is that the left communists seem to think that during peaceful conditions, the parliament plays a role, and then during revolutionary situations, the masses play a role, or extra parliamentary actions play a role. But Lenin disagrees with that. He says that, no, actually you should always do both. The masses are always more important than the parliament, even in peaceful times. And even in peaceful times, you should do parliamentary stuff, but also do extra parliamentary stuff. And even during revolutions, using the parliament can be useful. The book says like legal and illegal forms of struggle, but I think that's an issue of translation, because when he's talking about illegal struggle, I don't think it means that it's necessarily criminal, even though the Bolshevik Party was illegal in the Russian Empire. I think by illegal he simply means that it could be literally illegal, but also just extra parliamentary, something that is more direct action by the masses and not something that's officially recognized or through some kind of official capitalist institution. Then he goes on. He says that, quote, "The second sentence is in the first place historically wrong. The second sentence is the one that says that the parliament will become a center of the counter-revolution, while the masses themselves will build Soviets and then will abstain from parliaments." So Lenin says that that sentence is historically wrong. "We Bolsheviks participated in the most counter-revolutionary parliaments, and experience has shown that this participation was not only useful but indispensable to the party of the revolutionary proletariat after the first bourgeois revolution in Russia, 1905, so as to pave way for the second bourgeois revolution, February 1917, and then for the socialist revolution, October 1917. In the second place, this sentence is amazingly illogical. If a parliament becomes an organ and a center of counter-revolution, while the workers are building up the instruments of their own power in the form of the Soviets, then it follows that the workers must prepare ideologically, politically, and technically for the struggle of the Soviets against Parliament, for the dispersal of Parliament by the Soviets. But it does not at all follow that this dispersal is hindered or is not facilitated by the presence of a Soviet opposition within the counter-revolutionary Parliament. We know perfectly well that the dispersal of the Constituent Assembly on January 5, 1918, was not hampered but was actually facilitated by the fact that, within the counter-revolutionary Constituent Assembly, which was about to be dispersed, there was a consistent Bolshevik as well as an inconsistent left socialist revolutionary Soviet opposition. The so-called lefts in general argue in this respect like doctrinaires of the revolution who have never taken part in a real revolution, have never given thought to the history of revolutions, or have naively mistaken subjective rejection of a reactionary institution for its actual destruction by a combined operation of a number of objective factors. And that's a pretty strong argument. Like the left communists or any other similar people, they could claim that it's necessary to boycott the parliament and that participating in the parliament is harmful, but then they would have to explain how come in the October Revolution, which clearly was a successful socialist revolution, they participated in the parliament and then they actually carried out what everybody wants to do, which is they actually dissolved the parliament, but they did that while also participating in the parliament. So the left communists don't like that fact, but they still need to grapple with that reality. Lenin's theory and Lenin's argument is compelling and makes sense because it's based on actual real-life practice. It's demonstrably true. He can say, no, this actually happened. While the left communists, they don't have anything like that. They just say, oh, well, this is what we think. Well, on what basis, though? It goes against actual real life. Lenin says further, quote, of course, anyone would be in error who voiced the outmoded viewpoint or in general considered it impermissible in all and any circumstances to reject participation in bourgeois parliaments, unquote. If somebody said that it's never okay to boycott the parliament, then of course that would be wrong. Because sometimes it is correct, and sometimes it's even necessary to boycott the parliament. Then he gives examples. He says, quote, Russian experience has provided us with one successful and correct instance, 1905, and another that was incorrect, 1906, of the use of a boycott by the Bolsheviks. So they actually did boycott the parliament twice, and one time it worked, and another time it failed. Analyzing the first case, we see that we succeeded in preventing a reactionary government from convening a reactionary parliament in a situation in which extra-parliamentary revolutionary mass action, strikes in particular, was developing at great speed, when not a single section of the proletariat and the peasantry could support the reactionary government in any way, and when the revolutionary proletariat was gaining influence over the backward masses through the strike struggle and through the agrarian movement. It is quite obvious that this experience is not applicable to present-day European conditions, unquote. So, to give a little bit of historical context for that situation, during the 1905 bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia, they tried to overthrow the Tsarist autocracy, while the liberal capitalists, they wanted to preserve the monarchy and preserve the Tsarist autocracy, but they wanted certain concessions from it. So, the Tsar and the Russian government and the Russian monarchy then decided that to stop the revolution, they would create a parliament, and that this parliament would have extremely limited powers. It basically couldn't do anything. It's basically just a scam. But they wanted to create that so that the people would think, oh look, we got a good concession, now we can stop the revolution. So in that situation, participating in the parliament would have been terrible, because the whole point of the parliament was that the Russian Empire had created it to diminish and to stop the revolution. While in that situation, obviously, they needed to focus everything that they could to spread the revolution. And also because in that situation, the masses didn't really have all these parliamentary illusions. The masses actually didn't trust the parliament, so going into the parliament wouldn't have achieved anything. It only would have potentially increased people's trust in the parliament, which is not something that they wanted to do. In more typical conditions, it would be the other way around, because in typical conditions, people do trust the parliament. So the communists actually want to go into the parliament and then use it as a platform to explain to people why the parliament is actually just an instrument that the bourgeoisie uses for its own purposes. And then, a very important point, Lenin says that when the Bolsheviks did carry out this one successful boycott of the parliament, they had these very specific conditions that simply do not exist in Western countries currently, such as rampant bourgeois democratic revolution and a huge extra-legal peasant movement. When deciding if it makes sense to boycott something, you need to evaluate the actual real-life conditions. It's not some kind of blanket thing. Let's look at one more thing that Lenin says. Quote, in Western Europe and America, Parliament has become most odious to the revolutionary vanguard of the working class. That cannot be denied. It can readily be understood, for it is difficult to imagine anything more infamous, vile or treacherous than the behavior of the vast majority of socialist and social democratic parliamentary deputies during and after the war, that is, World War I. It would, however, be not only unreasonable but actually criminal to yield to this mood when deciding how this generally recognized evil should be fought. In many countries of Western Europe, the revolutionary mood, we might say, is at present a novelty or a rarity, which has all too long been vainly and impatiently awaited. Perhaps that is why people so easily yield to that mood. Certainly, without a revolutionary mood among the masses, and without conditions facilitating the growth of this mood, revolutionary tactics will never develop into action. But revolutionary tactics cannot be built on a revolutionary mood alone. Tactics must be based on a sober and strictly objective appraisal of all the class forces in a particular state, and of the states that surround it, and of all the states the world over, as well as of the experience of revolutionary movements. It is very easy to show one's quote-unquote revolutionary temper merely by hurling abuse at parliamentary opportunism or merely by repudiating participation in parliaments. Its very ease, however, cannot turn this into a solution of a very difficult problem." Unquote. So there's quite a lot to unpack there, but I think the first point that he's making is that the right-wing, social democrat, reformist parties at the time, they were so opportunist. They had completely betrayed the revolution, they had betrayed internationalism, they had become imperialist puppets. So in general, because parliamentary reformism was so corrupt, and because the whole parliamentary setup was just so corrupt and such a scam and a fraud, the radical workers didn't want to participate in parliament. But Lenin is saying that we shouldn't succumb to that idea, because even though the radical workers feel that, and we understand it, the vast majority of the masses don't see how corrupt the bourgeois system is, they don't see how fraudulent the elections are, and we shouldn't fall into this trap where, because reformist parties only focus on elections and nothing else, and they don't engage in any kind of mass action at all, because they're so incredibly opportunist and engage in right-wing opportunism, we shouldn't fall into the opposite extreme. We shouldn't become ultra-lefts who say that, okay, well, those guys, they're opportunist and they only focus on parliaments, so we will never do anything with parliaments. That's a very easy mistake to make. It's undialectical, metaphysical thinking, and Lenin wants to warn people against that. It's very easy to fall into something like that, and that's why it is often said that one type of opportunism breeds the opposite kind of opportunism, where people see like, oh, look, that's opportunist, let's go to the opposite extreme, which is also opportunist, instead of adopting the correct position. And then Lenin also cautions people that even though a revolutionary mood is one of the prerequisites of a revolutionary situation, it's still not enough. Even if the workers actually achieve class consciousness and even if they don't want to support capitalism anymore, that's only one side of the coin. The other side is that the bourgeoisie needs to be unable to defend its power. The objective conditions of a revolutionary situation consist of two things: the fact that the bourgeoisie cannot govern in the way that they used to, and that the workers want to change the situation. If those two things exist, then you have the objective conditions for a revolutionary situation. On top of that, you also need the subjective factor, which is the party, so you need to have a communist party that's able to lead that. But there have been historical instances where the workers have said, okay, we don't want this anymore, let's rebel. And then they do, but the bourgeoisie is too strong, so then the bourgeoisie defeats the revolution. So for a revolution to be successful, you need to analyze all the class forces and the situation of all the classes, not just the proletariat. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. Please consider hitting the like button and subscribing, and also feel free to post a comment. In the video description you will find a link to my blog, my Discord and my Patreon, as well as my email if you want to message me there.